there's an incredible science fiction book by Byzantine scholar Arkady Martine, and the book is called A Memory Called Empire. The epigraph of the novel, so the first thing you see when you open the book, simply says, "This book is dedicated to anyone who has ever fallen in love with a culture that was devouring their own." And as I was reading and learning about the Mishika people who would eventually become the Aztec Empire, this quote from Arkady Martine lived in my memory. That particular book is complicated, but it's about a galactic empire of sorts who is going out and conquering the far reaches of the galaxy. And if you're one of the small planets or small systems that gets swallowed up by this giant empire, you have these conflicted feelings. On the one hand, you're subjected to what we might call colonialism or imperialism, the imbalances in power, the restrictions and degradations, and death and tragedy that often comes as a result of these things. But on the other hand, that same empire may bring things that you find yourself attracted to. History and culture and literature and the ability to be part of something that brings people together. And maybe you can start to see the logic behind this epigraph of being in love with a culture that is devouring your own. And again, I couldn't help but think of this as I read about the Aztec Empire, and in some ways it's such a perfect thematic fit for the rise and the fall of the Aztecs. In the last episode, we talked about how the Mishika were this ethnic group in these larger Nahua cultural migrations that were happening south through what we would call modern-day Mexico. And the Mishika are this underdog group. They're often at war with other nomadic groups that are migrating with them until they find themselves at Tenochtitlan, this city that they can build and turn things around for the Mishika people. And all the while, they've been absorbing some of the cultural legacies of people from the Olmec Empire or the great city of Teotihuacan. Eventually, one of the leaders of the Mishika would marry a Colwa woman, and the Colwa were one of these groups that the Mishika were warring with. So you have this period of fighting, but now you have this period of cultural integration. And this episode is going to be about how the Mishika people from their home in Tenochtitlan eventually subdued and controlled the entire Valley of Mexico. The once underdogs would now be the top dogs. And all of a sudden, it would be the city-states around Tenochtitlan who, despite being subdued and forced to pay tribute, they would want to contribute to the Aztec Empire, be part of that culture, love something that was devouring them. At least to some extent. As we're going to find out, there were many city-states and many peoples in the Valley of Mexico that were not very happy with Aztec rule, and this will make a big difference in the story as we go on. But there were certainly some. Again, we have this idea of falling in love with a culture that's devouring your own. And of course, the great irony of all of this is that that very same process is going to happen to the Aztec people when they get conquered by the Spanish. The Mishika would go from underdog to top dog, back to underdog. And despite the brutality of the Spanish conquest, which we are going to learn was quite devastating, think about all the people in the former Aztec Empire who ended up converting to Christianity. Or think about the number of people who were speaking Spanish just 50 or 100 years after the conquest. So this idea of conquest and defeat, cultures being subsumed and assimilated and absorbed into others. I think something to think about during this period of Aztec history that we're going to be talking about here in this episode. In the last episode, we left off with the Mishika finding and founding the city of Tenochtitlan, the city on the lake. The Mishika got to work quickly, and one of the first things they did was build the floating gardens, sometimes called the chinampas. Historian Camilla Townsend, in her book Fifth Son, says, quote, "These were gardens arduously built in shallow waters by piling up mud and silt and then trapping some of the earth above the water level by constructing a wooden or straw basket ring wall. The chinampas, though difficult to build, were immensely fertile, and the Mishika were thus quick to follow their neighbors' example." End quote. The Mishika had learned from other city-states around them that this was the best way to farm in a aquatic environment, and they supplemented the chinampas with hunting, of course, fishing, and gaining tribute and food from other city-states around them, which we're going to talk about soon. With a secure base at Tenochtitlan, the Mishika people were led by their Tlatoani, which basically means king or chief. And the Tlatoani would make decisions about which surrounding city-states, and there were many in the Valley of Mexico, which of them to ally with, which of them to try to conquer for tribute. Because remember, the Mishika come from this long period of migration, and they were part of these larger Nahua migrations where you had different ethnic groups who would often coalesce into city-states, and at times they would conquer each other and then reconquer each other, and you could have marriage alliances between city-states that would last for certain periods of time before someone broke the contract. Typically, you would have a top dog city-state that everybody would have to pay tribute to, but a city-state like Tenochtitlan, which was on the rise, could force tribute from smaller areas around them as long as they continued to pay tribute to the top dog. So one way to secure your position in this political landscape is conquest and gaining tribute. But another way is through marriage. The first big Aztec leader that the histories tell us about is a man named Acamapichli. And his father was a Mishika leader who married a Colwa woman. Remember that these were two groups that were fighting each other for a large portion of Mishika history. But this marriage merges the two groups together, and in some ways it makes the Mishika legitimate. And in this atmosphere of Tenochtitlan and the Mishika now being legitimate, it is Acamapichli who then marries a Colwa noblewoman of his own and has a son named Huitzawili. But the Mishika Tlatoanis often had multiple wives and even palace concubines. And Acamapichli also had a son with one of these concubines named Itzcoatl. And these two sons of Acamapichli, Huitzawili and Itzcoatl, demonstrate another important political theme of Tenochtitlan and this rising Mishika power, which is polygyny. Mishika leaders often had multiple brides, and they would have multiple sons, and oftentimes these sons would jostle for power as far as who's going to be the next ruler. It's important to understand that in this system of polygyny, there was no primogeniture, which means there was not automatic inheritance by the oldest son. What there was instead was kind of a coalescing of opinion over time as far as which son was going to be the most ready and the most primed to take over as leader. Oftentimes this had to do with feats in war or athletic abilities or general strength, because the Mishika felt that in this very fluid world of gaining tribute from other city-states and oftentimes being at war almost constantly, you wanted to have a leader who was experienced and capable in that realm. Historian Camilla Townsend talks about what would happen if there were multiple boys born of a Tlatoani as far as figuring out who was going to be the next ruler. She says, quote, "There was certainly no concept of primogeniture. It would have been utterly impractical in such a fluid world in which the people needed a highly competent leader, not merely one who happened to have been born first. Older boys, however, certainly had an advantage over younger ones. As the sons of a chief's most powerful wife grew up, their personalities and relative athletic abilities caused one among them to be perceived as the most likely heir, while his brothers grew to accept expectations that they would be high priests or powerful military figures who stood by his side. All would be equally well rewarded for their efforts, with gifts of land and other forms of wealth. So it was to all of the full brothers' advantage to support the one who seemed most likely an appropriate chief." End quote. So as Camilla Townsend says there, the rulership does not necessarily go to the older son, but there is this feeling out process where, over time, the city-state as a whole is going to get a sense for who becomes the next leader. There's no doubt that polygyny was a crucial part of the Aztec political system. And for the Mishika, it worked, at least during the period of their rise to power from the mid-1300s into the mid-1400s. But anyone familiar with ancient history knows that polygyny often comes with some pros and some cons. And of course, the major con is, what if you get a son or multiple sons who don't accept who the next ruler is going to be? And what happens if the sons of the king develop into factions, and you could see how this would easily lead to maybe even a civil war? And if not war, you can have rivalries and jealousies between the different wives and their offspring, and it certainly can be a source of division. Camilla Townsend outlines the pros of the polygyny system, saying, quote, "The Nahuas were so accustomed to the phenomenon that they did not see a problem. They saw it as a net positive, and in fact, they were not entirely wrong. Whatever our modern sensibilities may tell us, polygyny does have many benefits. It offers obvious pleasures to the senior male with multiple wives. And even the wives in such situations often say that it is a help to them as they age to bring younger women into the household, as many hands make light work. Nahua wives certainly never sought or expected romantic love from a husband. It did not surprise them when men were fickle, nor did anyone in their world blame the women. Furthermore, polygyny generally eliminates any possibility of a king dying without an heir, and it creates a veritable clan of young men who pride themselves on their relationships to each other and who will stand together in times of crisis." End quote. Such is certainly the case when things are going well. And for Huitzilopochtli, the son of Akamapichli, things were going well. He ruled for about 24 years towards the end of the 1300s or maybe the beginning of the 1400s. He conquered a bunch of rival city-states and demanded tribute from them, enlarging the prestige of Tenochtitlan and expanding the scope of the territory that they controlled. He also made Tenochtitlan a tribute state of the big boss city-state of the Valley of Mexico at this time, which was Azcapotzalco. Azcapotzalco was a city-state made up primarily of the Tepanec ethnic group, another one of these Nahua wanderers. So Huitzilopochtli rules for, again, about 24 years, and he has a son named Chimalpopoca. And this is where the system of polygyny and political alliances that are happening in the Valley of Mexico through all of these different Nahua cultures and city-states starts to fracture. The big boss city-state of Azcapotzalco has a ruler named Mashtala. And he's doing all of the same things that we just described the Mishika doing. Marrying the wives of other city-states to form alliances, having various inheritors and sons of all sorts of different wives, using those sons to make more alliances with other city-states. And in the process of a long and convoluted series of wars here, Mashtala of Azcapotzalco ends up murdering the Mexica king, Chimalpopoca. With the city in crisis and no obviously good son of Chimalpopoca to rule, the Mexica turn to Itzcoatl. Remember that Itzcoatl was the son of a Kamapichli from the slave woman's side. So he's the uncle of Chimalpopoca and the brother of Huitzilopochtli. Itzcoatl was a famed warrior, and the first thing he does is he allies the city-states of Tenochtitlan with Texcoco, who is a Colwa ethnic city-state, and Tlacopan, another powerful city-state in the area. The combined power of those three city-states is able to win the war versus Mashtala and avenge his people. And those three city-states ruling with Tenochtitlan as the top dog is essentially what we now call the Aztec Empire. And as top dog of the Aztec Empire, Itzcoatl and the Mexica in Tenochtitlan could go about establishing the political system that would allow them to build out Tenochtitlan. Itzcoatl would very cleverly allow Huitzilopochtli's son to rule after him and not his own son. And this was on the understanding that because of the polygyny system, you have these two different streams of rulers, going back to a Kamapichli. One from his son from the Colwa noblewoman side, and the other from his son from the slave woman's side, who was Itzcoatl. Itzcoatl foresaw that this could lead to problems later. So again, he very cleverly decides to let Huitzilopochtli's son rule after him on the understanding that his own grandson would rule later. And eventually, as time went on, the bloodlines would mix. And as they continued alternating which side of the family would rule, eventually those bloodlines would mix and it would become less of an issue, which is exactly what happened. Heading into the middle 1400s, the Aztec Empire was becoming a powerhouse, and they continued to build out the city of Tenochtitlan. They would build public works like roads or great temples, continue fighting in wars and gaining more tribute. And I think it's worth discussing how this tribute system worked. After the Mishika conquered a city-state, they could demand a certain number of bales of cotton. They could demand bags of corn or beans. They could demand a certain amount of chocolate. And for states who resisted or rebelled consistently, those city-states could also be required to send people as sacrifices in religious ceremonies. And make no mistake about it, the fighting and the taking of slaves and prisoners of war could be absolutely brutal and total. This account of a Mexica conquest of another city-state comes from a Spanish friar known as Friar Duran. So the account happens way after the event took place, of course, and it's coming from the perspective of the Spanish, so you should take it with a grain of salt. So take it for what it's worth, but this does seem to be how the process of Mexica conquest went. The friar says, quote, "The soldiers from all the allied provinces took many captives, both men and women, for they and the Mexica entered the city, burned the temple, sacked and robbed the place. They killed old and young, boys and girls, annihilating without mercy everyone they could, with great cruelty and with the determination to remove all traces of the Washtec people from the face of the earth. End quote. After a conquest like this, prisoners of war would be captured, tethered together, and sent back to Tenochtitlan in chains. There, they could be divided up as slaves. Typically, the rich of the city would take some for work at the temples or in their own households. Women would be used as concubines, and some were sent to the temples to be sacrificed. But before we get to human sacrifice here, it's worth discussing slavery in Mishika society. And it's a little bit of a difficult subject to broach, along with all of these ideas around human sacrifice, because we do have these obvious stereotypes that have followed around the Aztecs since the beginning of the recording of their history, mostly by the Spanish. And we outlined some of these barbarian-style stereotypes in the first episode. But it is true that the Aztecs had slavery as one of the main pillars of their society. Generally, you did have slaves who were taken as prisoners of war, and sometimes the men were sacrificed. You could also have slaves who were there due to debts they had accumulated. People who committed crimes could become slaves. Servants could essentially indenture themselves into slavery, working as house slaves or sex slaves. And chiefs of other city-states could also sell people into slavery as tribute payment. All that being said, the children of slaves usually never became slaves. In a world where prisoners of war are taken rapidly and slaves are increasing in number, if you allow the children of slaves to become slaves, all of a sudden, you could be severely outnumbered. Of course, this was the great fear of later slave owners in colonial societies like the Spanish in Mexico or the United States South. And again, these ideas about Aztec slavery and Aztec human sacrifice are not misconceptions because they didn't happen. They did happen. As we just outlined, a Mishika conquest could be absolutely brutal. City-states around Tenochtitlan lived in absolute fear of them. They subjugated and killed countless people. But the misconception or the superstition around these two factors really comes down to why they did it. And most historians that I've read here offer up very human motivations. Power, control, fear, maybe just the knowledge that the Mishika people had gone through this themselves when they were the underdog nomadic groups and when they had to pay tribute to other more powerful city-states. Certainly not an excuse or a justification for slavery and human sacrifice, but we have to understand that these systems become political realities that are central to the overall political context that Tenochtitlan existed in. They were systems that were responses that worked politically for the Aztec Empire, not barbaric superstitions that they did because they were somehow subhuman or not intelligent enough to figure out that this stuff was wrong. Talking about human sacrifice in this context, Camilla Townsend says, quote, "Horrendous misconceptions have grown around the Aztec practice of human sacrifice. In novels, movies, and even some of the older history books, hundreds of people at a time were made to climb the narrow steps of the pyramids to the top, where their hearts were cut out and their bodies hurled downward, while the people screamed in near ecstasy below." End quote. In reality, human sacrifice was probably not the bloodthirsty, savage, superstitious violence that it often gets portrayed as in movies like Apocalypto. It was probably a quiet and ceremonial experience for the audience. Oftentimes, the sacrifice was treated as kind of being in a place of honor before being killed. In reality, it did not involve dozens or hundreds at a time, probably only a couple on holy days. It did have an association with the Aztec religion. We know that human sacrifice is important thematically for the religion of the Aztecs, but we don't have a great understanding of exactly what they believed and why. After all, some elements of religion are mystifying anyway. And the idea that gods would require human sacrifice of their people is not a uniquely Aztec idea at all. We see evidence of this throughout cultures and civilizations, and also throughout religions. We see evidence of this in the Hebrew Bible, in English lore, and some people might even interpret the central mystery of Christianity with Jesus dying on the cross in this way as well. Again, we're not trying to make direct comparisons here. All we're trying to do is demystify this practice of human sacrifice a little bit and maybe put some historical context around it. But certainly, as the Aztecs grew more powerful and as they captured more city-states and gained more territory, they did sacrifice more people and more enemies. And it's worth wondering what they might have thought about all this. Lots of ink has been spilt on the page and lots of voices speaking into microphones contemplating the morality of what the Aztecs were doing. The Spanish immediately were horrified by this practice of human sacrifice and terrified by it, which may have been the point from an Aztec perspective. And thus was born this legend of the Aztecs as superstitious, brutal killers who are somehow non-human. Camilla Townsend offers another narrative to this idea, wondering what the Aztecs thought about all this themselves. She says, quote, "Did they know that the world would not shatter like jade if they did not sacrifice living human beings? Did they laugh cynically at the terror they inspired and the political power they wielded as a result? Probably there were some brilliant strategists and far-seeing, experienced people who did, perhaps like Itzcoat. They would not have been alone among world leaders. We know that there were some Greek and Roman leaders, for instance, who questioned the very existence of the gods, yet did not let it shake their worldview. Surely there were many more of the Mishika who simply never thought much about it, like people in so many times and places who choose not to see the pain inflicted on other people when it is more convenient not to. Can we blame them? Should we blame them?" End quote. Maybe the reasons behind human sacrifice were actually very human. Maybe they believed the gods had to be honored and human sacrifice was the way to do this, so they did it. Maybe they thought they had been on the other side of conquest and oppression and tribute for a long time, and now it was their turn. Maybe they thought it was the duty of the strong to dominate the weak, and this is just how the world works. Or as Camilla Townsend said there, maybe they just didn't think about it at all. And what is more human than turning a blind eye to terror and suffering? Maybe that's the practical way to go about things. One Mishika story that mothers would apparently tell children, according to the Florentine Codex, says, quote, "On earth we live. We travel along a mountain peak. Over here is an abyss. Over there is an abyss. If you go this way or that way, you will fall in. Only in the middle do we go, do we live." End quote. So perhaps practicality was key for the Mishika. This major theme of political practicality and how much this rubs against superstition and ritual ceremony in Aztec history all comes together with something known as the Flower Wars. There was a city-state, a powerful one, known as Tlaxcala, and the Mishika were never able to fully suppress this powerful city-state. Tlaxcala was known as Bread Town, the place of the tortillas. It was located strategically on high ground, so it was very easy to defend. The Tlaxcalans had soldiers and tributaries of their own, and they never fully submitted to the Aztec Empire. What ends up happening is that on preordained days, the Aztecs and Tlaxcalans would go to war in the closest thing you'll ever find historically to the Hunger Games. They would choose the battlefield between them, agree on a spot to fight, and then they would go to war. Prisoners of war captured by Tenochtitlan would be sent home for human sacrifice or for slavery. And so at first glance, these flower wars, as they came to be known, seem to provide evidence for that superstitious narrative that we've been talking about with the Aztec. There's ritual and ceremonial components to warfare, and this connects to their religion and their need to sacrifice the human prisoners of war that they capture. So at first glance, this stuff seems like the very definition of superstition and ritual and brutal and violent behavior that doesn't really have a good explanation. Historically speaking, the Spanish and many others took all of this flower war stuff to mean that the version of Aztec warfare that mattered was just about collecting prisoners and ritually sacrificing them for religious purposes. There's a superstitious element to this, and some people attribute this to why the Spanish were able to conquer the Aztec, because the Aztecs seemed to just be about collecting prisoners for these ritual purposes. Meanwhile, the Spanish are concerned with winning. Unfortunately for that narrative of the Aztec, more modern scholarship basically says that none of that is accurate, and most of it can be misleading. Firstly, the Aztec desire for prisoners of war did satisfy their religion. But as anthropologist Barry L. Isaac points out, we have to remember that in ancient societies, religion is very much tied into the culture of any society. And it was the same way for the Aztec. Yes, the priests want victims to be able to sacrifice to the gods, but from a more human perspective, nobles in Aztec society could achieve honors or privileges by participating in something like the Flower Wars. By bringing home prisoners of war, they're going to look better in the eyes of the leader of Tenochtitlan. They're going to have more slaves to contribute to their household and their noble families. They're going to gain prestige for when it comes time to figure out who's in the rankings for advancements or positions in other war parties. Common people in Aztec society could actually rise up the ranks of society into the upper class. If they performed well in the Flower Wars, they could go from just a common grunt to a well-respected noble person. Secondly, Barry L. Isaac looks at what happens when the Aztec desire for tribute collides with their desire to get prisoners of war. So he looks historically at some of the fighting that the Aztec did, and he finds that the desire for tribute wins out over the desire for prisoners of war. So this seems to indicate the Aztec priorities were actually to win and control of their city-states, gain tribute, control power. Again, all of the things we would associate with normal human nature. Another very practical explanation for the ritual flower wars was that they would keep the Aztec military sharp. Here you have a close city-state in Tlaxcala who you can fight, keep the military sharp, take prisoners of war from on a consistent basis. And this could be a benefit from the larger bureaucratic governing structure from that perspective. And in some ways, the Aztec may have looked at this as its own form of tribute, kind of elevating the Tlaxcalans above the normal city-states who are paying them tribute into their own realm of respect, and this tribute happening through the flower wars. Another very practical explanation for the ritual flower wars that Barry L. Isaac gives is that maybe very simply the Aztec just couldn't conquer the Tlaxcalans. They were too good of fighters. The territory they controlled was too difficult to attack. And maybe the Aztec just rationalized this lack of conquest by putting out the narrative and the propaganda that these flower wars were a form of ritual tribute. Barry L. Isaac says, quote, "We need not naively accept as fact the indigenous nobility's religious explanations for warfare policy and conduct. What empire has not put forth and fervently believed religious rationalizations for such matters?" End quote. We can see that it's much more likely that instead of some sort of superstitious religious warfare connected to religion exclusively, the flower wars were more likely a decision by the Mishika that instead of a costly war that would be needed to force tribute, the Mishika would let Tlaxcala exist independently as long as they continued to participate in these flower wars. And this decision is backed up by political necessity, socioeconomic reality, religion, and cultural factors, as we've shown, not merely superstition. But that doesn't mean that enmity and hatred wouldn't exist between Tenochtitlan and the Tlaxcalans. Because eventually Tenochtitlan would probably regret not crushing Tlaxcala completely. A time would come where Tlaxcala would ally with a new and powerful invader, one that would take down the Aztec Empire. And as you read the history, it's hard not to think ahead to what's coming, especially when you read about the brutality of the Aztec conquest and things like the flower wars and the hatred that must have stoked in places like Tlaxcala or like city-states that did not fully submit to the rule of Tenochtitlan. I thought about this as I read that supposedly whenever a new leader of the empire, a new Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, gained power, they went out on a initial military conquest to demonstrate their bravery and show that they were going to continue steering the empire in the right direction. And that first military campaign and the victory they would inevitably win was a big deal. Before the newly appointed ruler went out on that military campaign, supposedly a priest would get a ceremony together and they would ask the new ruler rhetorical questions. The Aztec emperor would respond to them saying no. Camilla Townsend quotes from the Florentine Codex here this exchange between a priest and, in this case, Chimalpopoca. Here the priest is asking the questions, quote, "Will you see a time of fear? Will it fall to you to declare war? Will the city-state be engulfed in war? Will it be your responsibility? Will the city-state crumble in war? Will it be surrounded by enemies? Will there be agitation, tremors? Will the city lie abandoned, lie darkened? Will it become a place of desolation? Will our people be enslaved? End quote. Supposedly, Chimalpopoca responded no to all of those questions. With the benefit of hindsight, we can look back on that exchange and say, maybe not now, but soon. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.